October rain falls sideways across 43 acres of land no one has touched in 30 years. The fields have gone to ruin. The fence posts lean like tired men, and at the end of a gravel road nearly swallowed by forest, a Victorian farmhouse sags under the weight of its own forgetting broken windows covered in plastic, a roof collapsing 1 inch at a time, a front door that hasn't opened since the last owner vanished without explanation. A rust-spotted Honda idles at the edge of the driveway. Inside, a woman grips a deed so tightly her knuckles have gone white. $400 in the bank, 2 boys asleep in the back seat, and a text message glowing on her phone: the kids deserve better than your fantasies. She steps out into the rain. What she doesn't know yet, what no one in this county has known for 40 years, is that beneath this cursed soil, something is waiting. A woman stood on the steps of the Monroe County Courthouse holding a piece of paper that meant nothing to anyone but her. Rain slashed sideways across the plaza, soaking through a jacket too thin for October, but Hazel Beckworth did not move. She stood perfectly still, the way a person stands when the ground beneath them has already given way, and all that remains is the slow recognition of falling. In her right hand, the deed to 43 acres of land no one wanted. In her bank account, $400.37, and in the back seat of a rust-spotted Honda parked at the curb, 2 boys who still believed their mother knew what she was doing. People in town called the property the Devil's Backyard. The county assessor had smirked when he stamped the transfer. Her ex-husband had texted the word dirt pile before she even left the building. But what none of them knew, what Hazel herself would not discover for another 72 hours, was that beneath that cursed soil lay something worth more than every house on the street where she used to live. Before we continue, if stories like this one mean something to you, stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay where the world puts them, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one. The courthouse door slammed behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Hazel folded the deed carefully, protecting it inside her jacket against her chest, the way you might hold a letter from someone who had died, not because the contents brought comfort, but because throwing it away would mean admitting that the last thread had already snapped. She descended the steps, rainwater pooling in the cracks of the old limestone, and crossed the plaza toward the Honda, idling at the curb with its hazard lights blinking. Her phone buzzed against her hip. She did not need to look to know who it was. The screen confirmed it anyway. Graham. His message was brief, surgically aimed the way all his cruelties were. Classic Hazel, buying a dirt pile. The kids deserve better than your fantasies. She deleted the text without replying. 9 years of marriage had taught her the geometry of his contempt, how it arrived disguised as concern, how it always targeted the place where she was already bleeding. The successful investment banker had once found her passion for geology charming, even attractive, back when it was a quirk rather than a competing ambition. The pressure to quit her research position had been relentless, dressed up as love for the boys. Someone needed to be home with the twins, he had insisted, someone stable. Hazel slid into the driver's seat, pulling the door shut against the rain. In the rearview mirror she found 4 eyes watching her. Emmett and Sawyer were huddled together beneath a shared blanket in the back seat, their 10-year-old faces carrying a solemnity that no child should wear. Suitcases and boxes were crammed around them, the compressed remains of a life that had taken years to build and weeks to dismantle. Emmett's breathing came in a thin whistle, his asthma always worsening when the world tightened around him. The inhaler in Hazel's purse was nearly empty. The prescription refill would cost what little cash remained after the drive south. Sawyer, older by 7 minutes, and a lifetime of self-appointed responsibility, had his arm wrapped around his brother's shoulders. His eyes met Hazel's in the mirror, and the question in them was the same one she had been asking herself since the judge signed the final decree. His voice came quiet, careful, as if he already understood that some questions carry more weight than their words. "Where are we going to live now, Mom?" Hazel turned the key. The engine coughed twice before catching each sputter, a small reminder of everything she could not afford to fix. She forced a smile that felt like pressing her hand against broken glass. "We're going home, sweetie, to our farm." Emmett's eyes widened, his wheezing momentarily forgotten. "We have a farm. We do now. 43 acres. She did not add that every one of those acres had been written off as wasteland by the county, that the property tax assessment listed the soil as unsuitable for agriculture, that the only structures were a Victorian farmhouse no one had lived in for 30 years, and a barn the color of dried blood. She did not mention that the locals had a name for the property-cursed land, or that the last owner had disappeared under circumstances no one cared to explain. Sawyer's forehead creased out, folding across his young face in a way that made Hazel's chest physically ache, because the expression was Graham's. The same skeptical tilt, the same premature certainty that the world operated on disappointment. But Dad said, "It's just dirt." Hazel's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Your father doesn't know everything, though he thinks he does. This land has water underneath it. I can feel it. And where there's water, there's life." The highway stretched before them, carrying them mile by mile away from the subdivision where the boys had learned to ride bikes, and towards the rural outskirts of the county where the landscape changed like a sentence shifting tense. Manicured lawns gave way to rolling pasture, dotted with cattle, then wilder terrain, where forest crowded the road and the sky widened overhead. Emmett and Sawyer drifted to sleep against each other, their breathing synchronized in that unconscious twinship that still, after 10 years, moved Hazel to something close to wonder. She drove with the rain, and her thoughts calculating how long they could stretch their supplies, what they would need to make the farmhouse livable, how she would get the boys to the nearest school, 15 miles of winding 2-lane road each direction. The list grew faster than solutions, each item spawning two more, a fractal of impossibility, expanding with every mile. 20 minutes from their destination, Emmet's breathing changed. The thin whistle sharpened into a ragged pull each inhale, catching on something invisible in his chest. Hazel's eyes snapped to the mirror. Sawyer was already awake, sitting up, his hand on his brother's back, his face a mask of practiced calm that no 10-year-old should know how to wear. Hazel pulled onto the shoulder, threw the car into park, and lunged across the center console, digging through her purse. The inhaler had rolled under the passenger seat. Her fingers found it, and she pressed it into Emmet's small hands. 2 puffs. The medication hissed into desperate lungs. Gradually, too gradually, the wheezing subsided, leaving Emmet pale and slick with sweat, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. Not enough medicine left to last the week. Hazel swallowed against the tightness in her own throat, and added the prescription to the list of necessities they could not afford, silently rearranging priorities in a calculation that had no solution. The dashboard clock read 4:17 p.m. If they moved now, they might reach the property before dark. The turnoff came without warning, a gravel road nearly swallowed by overgrown bushes, invisible unless you were looking for it. A weathered sign dangled from a single chain, Marsh Farm, established 1889, and beneath it, in fading red spray paint, someone had added 2 words, cursed land. Keep out. Hazel's stomach twisted. She turned onto the rutted path anyway, the Honda bottoming out twice on potholes, deep enough to swallow a wheel. The driveway stretched nearly half a mile, curving through thick stands of oak and maple, their autumn leaves blazing in the last daylight before the trees opened suddenly into a clearing and the farmhouse materialized like something surfacing from deep water. It must have been impressive once. Victorian bones, a wrap-around porch, multiple gables reaching toward the sky, but decades of neglect had unmade whatever beauty the builders intended. Paint curled from the clapboards like dead skin. 2 upstairs windows gaped open, covered with plastic sheeting that flapped in the wind. The roof sagged badly in one corner, a slow-motion collapse that gravity was winning by inches. Beyond the house, the land rolled toward a distant tree line, overgrown fields, a cluster of outbuildings in various states of surrender, and a barn whose red paint had faded to the pink of an old scar. The late afternoon sun chose that moment to break through the clouds, casting the neglected landscape in gold, as if offering an opinion no one had asked for. From the back seat, Sawyer's voice came flat with disbelief. "Mom, it's falling apart." Hazel kept her own voice bright, the effort of it scraping against her ribs. "The bones are good, and look at all this space." Emmet pressed his face against the window, his earlier distress already receding into the background of 10-year-old resilience. "Is that our barn? Can we have animals?" "We'll see Buddy. First things first." She parked beside the porch steps. For a long moment, none of them moved. The magnitude of what lay ahead settled over the car like weather, and Hazel felt it in her shoulders, her jaw the place behind her eyes where exhaustion stored itself for later. Then Sawyer squared his small shoulders and reached for the door handle. "I'll help carry stuff, Mom." Hazel blinked, reached back and squeezed his hand. Her serious boy, always trying to bridge the gap between what he was and what the world seemed to require. "I know you will." The brass skeleton key from the county office slid into the front door lock with surprising ease. It turned with a solid clunk, the mechanism still functional despite years of disuse. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing the stale breath of abandoned rooms, dust, old wood, the mineral smell of damp plaster. The foyer opened to a central staircase, its banister still elegant beneath a thick fur of dust. To the left, a former living room anchored by a stone fireplace. To the right, a dining room where a crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling at a precarious angle, as if it had spent 30 years deciding whether to fall. Emmett sneezed 3 times, the sound ricocheting through empty rooms that had forgotten what human noise sounded like. They moved through the first floor cautiously, their footsteps creaking on warped boards. The kitchen was a museum exhibit from the 1970s, avocado-colored appliances, chipped laminate counters, cabinet doors hanging at angles from broken hinges. A heavy oak table remained in the center, buried under a layer of fallen ceiling plaster. When Hazel tried a light switch, nothing happened. When she turned a faucet, the pipes groaned once deeply and produced nothing. Sawyer's question was practical, devoid of complaint. "Does the electricity work?" "We'll need to check the breaker box. For tonight we have flashlights and the camping lantern." Upstairs they found 4 bedrooms connected by a central hallway. The largest had twin beds still in place, their mattresses stripped and wrapped in plastic. Emmett claimed the room, immediately bouncing on one bed and raising a cloud of dust that sent him into a coughing fit Hazel pretended not to worry about. As twilight thickened outside the grimy windows, Hazel focused on creating one habitable space for their first night. She chose the master bedroom, making up the bed with clean sheets from the suitcases, while the boys carried in their cooler of sandwiches, bottles of water, and the camping lantern that threw long shadows across walls they did not yet know. They ate sitting cross-legged on the bed. The 3 of them huddled in a circle of light, surrounded by the vast darkness of a house that had been waiting for reasons Hazel could not yet name for someone to arrive. Emmett chewed his sandwich with one hand and held Hazel's wrist with the other, his fingers finding the pulse point as if confirming she was still there. Sawyer sat slightly apart, his gaze fixed on the window where rain had begun to streak the glass again. "Mom, what if the water never works? What if we can't fix anything?" Hazel set down her own sandwich. She met her son's eyes, Graham's eyes, but without the cruelty. Not yet, maybe never, if she could protect what remained. "Then we figure out the next thing. That's what we do. We figure out the next thing." The first night was long. Wind found every gap in the old structure, creating sounds that belonged to no category Hazel could name. Not whistles, not moans, but something between the house, speaking in a language she had not yet learned. The boys fell asleep, pressed against her sides, their breathing gradually synchronizing, and Hazel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Robert's text replaying behind her eyes. The children deserve better. Was he right? Had she made a catastrophic mistake? Rain returned before dawn, a steady drumming on the roof, punctuated by a new sound, the distinct plink of water dripping somewhere in the room. Hazel rose quietly, followed the sound to a corner where a dark stain was blooming across the ceiling plaster, and positioned the empty cooler beneath the leak. She stood there for a moment, watching water fall into the plastic container one drop at a time, steady as a heartbeat, and thought about how strange it was that the same substance could destroy a roof and sustain a life. She added roof repair to her list, knowing she could not afford it, and went back to bed. Morning light was merciless. It exposed every sag, every stain, every place where time had bitten through the structure and kept chewing. The fields were chest-high with weeds. Fence lines lay collapsed. The barn's massive doors hung crookedly from rusted tracks. But Hazel's trained eye, the geologist's eye she had spent 5 years pretending did not exist, saw past the surface, the rolling contours of the terrain, the types of vegetation clustering in the low areas, the exposed rock in the far eastern corner, its color and texture telling a story about what lay beneath. People did not build farms where water could not be found. Someone had known this land's secret once. Hazel just needed to rediscover it. While the boys explored outside, their wariness already beginning to crack under the pressure of 10-year-old curiosity, Hazel investigated the kitchen more carefully. The refrigerator was beyond rescue. The gas stove might work if the propane tank could be filled. She opened drawers of outdated utensils, cabinets of cloudy glassware. And in the back of one drawer, her fingers found something that did not belong among the rusted whisks and bent spatulas. A sealed envelope, yellowed with age, the paper thick and expensive, across the front in handwriting so precise it looked almost architectural. Someone had written for the new family. Hazel's pulse quickened as she broke the seal. The letter inside was a single page. The ink faded to the brown of old tea, but every word legible. To whoever finds this, the land has secrets. Not the kind that hurt, but the kind that heal if you listen. The well may be dry, but water waits below. Trust the old ways. Trust your instincts. This farm has been called cursed, but only by those who cannot see. What lies beneath is more precious than what grows above. Look for my notes in the cellar beneath the kitchen. The entrance is hidden under the pantry floor. There you will find the truth and the way forward. Water finds its way. So will you, Dorothea Marsh. P.S. If my niece Lucille ever comes looking, tell her I kept my promise. Hazel read the letter twice. The third time she read it with the part of her brain that Graham had spent years trying to quiet, the scientist, the woman who had once stood in front of conference rooms full of skeptical colleagues and defended her research with data and conviction and the stubborn refusal to be dismissed. Dorothea Marsh had not been some eccentric recluse. She had been conducting research about what exactly the letter's cryptic language did not say. But the reference to water, to things more precious, stirred something in Hazel's professional memory. Mineral deposits, geological anomalies, the kinds of formations that existed in this part of North Carolina where the Appalachian foothills concealed ancient secrets beneath unremarkable soil. She tucked the letter into her pocket beside the deed, 2 pieces of paper that might yet mean something, and moved to the pantry. A small room off the kitchen, empty shelves, worn wooden floor. She knelt and examined the planks, running her fingers along the seams the way she had once examined core samples, looking for the break in the pattern. She found it after several minutes, a rectangular outline slightly darker than the surrounding wood. No handle, but when she pressed firmly on one edge, the opposite side lifted. The trapdoor rose with surprising ease. Below it, wooden stairs descended into darkness. Emmett's voice from the kitchen doorway made her jump. "Mom, what are you doing?" Hazel hesitated only a breath. "I found something. Grab the flashlight from my backpack." Moments later, with both boys crowding behind her on the narrow stairs, Hazel descended into the cellar. The flashlight beam swept through musty darkness and found something that stopped her at the bottom step. This was not a root cellar, not a storage space, not anything that belonged beneath a neglected farmhouse in rural North Carolina. Metal shelving units lined the walls, holding rows of labeled rock and soil samples, organized by grid location and depth. A drafting table dominated the center of the space, its surface covered with geological survey maps protected by a sheet of clear plastic, and positioned around the room with the care of someone who understood their value, a seismograph core, sampling tools, and what appeared to be a ground-penetrating radar unit, all of it at least 40 years old, all of it once. State-of-the-art. Hazel moved through the space slowly, her professional appreciation building with each step. Dorothea Marsh had been a geologist, not an amateur, not a hobbyist with a rock collection, but someone with serious scientific training and the resources to equip a private research laboratory. The maps on the drafting table showed detailed surveys of the property, handwritten notes marking specific locations with annotations in the same precise script as the letter. One area near the eastern boundary had been circled repeatedly. Beside it in ink, pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper, a single word: kimberlite. Hazel's breath stopped in her chest. Kimberlite, the volcanic rock formation that serves as a conduit from deep within the Earth's mantle to the surface, the formation most commonly associated in geological literature and in the dreams of prospectors for 2 centuries with diamonds. She leaned closer, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hand. Below the circled area, smaller notations, vertical pipe structure, confirmed via seismic readings, consistent with kimberlite intrusion through limestone substrate, and in the margin written with what felt like controlled fury, Prewitt offered $15,000 insulting, he knows. Prewitt. The name detonated a small charge in Hazel's memory. Prewitt Mining and Development, she had seen their signs on the drive south, their name on quarry trucks rumbling through the county. A local company with deep roots in limestone extraction and mineral operations. If Desmond Prewitt or his father before him had offered to buy this property, and if that offer had been rejected, and if the property had subsequently been labeled worthless and cursed, the implications arranged themselves in Hazel's mind with the clean logic of a geological survey. Dorothea Marsh had found something valuable, something she refused to sell, and someone had made sure she paid for that refusal. Emmett tugged at Hazel's sleeve, his voice hushed with the instinctive reverence children bring to hidden places. What is all this stuff? Scientific equipment for studying what's underground. Sawyer had picked up a labeled rock sample, turning it in the flashlight beam. Is this what the letter meant? About secrets. Hazel nodded, her mind already racing ahead, connecting Dorothea's research to the county's dismissal of the land, to Prewitt's lowball offer decades ago, to the convenient mythology of a curse that kept everyone away. Whether the Kimberlite theory was correct remained to be proven, but the existence of this laboratory, meticulous, professional, deliberately hidden, changed everything. This property was not a desperate last resort. It was an unanswered question. And Hazel Beckworth, whatever else Graham had taken from her, was still a scientist. A metallic creak from outside broke the spell. Hazel gestured for the boys to stay put and climbed quickly back up to the kitchen. Through the front window, she saw a red pickup truck in the driveway, its paint so faded it nearly matched the barn. An elderly man was climbing out, tall, unhurried, wearing the uniform of rural America, worn jeans, work boots, a flannel shirt beneath a canvas jacket. His face was weathered into deep creases by decades of sun and wind, but his pale blue eyes were sharp, taking in the Honda the boys' faces at the window, the obvious decay of the property, all in a single sweep. Hazel stepped onto the porch. The man stopped at the bottom of the steps, hands in his jacket pockets, and regarded her with an expression that contained neither judgment nor pity, just assessment, the way a farmer looks at a field before deciding what it needs. His voice was low and unhurried, gravel smoothed by years of use. "You must be the new owner. I'm Orrin Patchett. My wife Tina and I have the farm adjoining yours to the north." Hazel introduced herself, then called the twins out. Orrin shook hands with each boy solemnly, his weathered palm engulfing their small fingers. His expression softened at Emmett's polite, "Nice to meet you, sir," and Sawyer's firm grip. Then his gaze returned to Hazel, and the softness receded. "You know what you've gotten yourself into. I know it needs work." Orrin shook his head once. "Not talking about the repairs, though Lord knows there are plenty. I'm talking about this land itself. No one's made it work in 30 years. Soil won't hold water. They call it the Marsh curse, named after the woman who owned it Not the wetland kind. Opposite problem, actually. Dry as bone. Hazel's fingers found Dorothea's letter in her pocket. Water finds its way. I've heard the rumors, but I have some ideas about the water situation. Oren's eyebrows rose a small motion that conveyed significant recalibration. You're a scientist? Was, before marriage, before the boys, but I still remember how to read the ground. A long pause, Oren studying her with whatever internal instrument he used to measure people, then a single nod, a decision made. Tina sent me with this. He returned to his truck and came back with a covered casserole dish. Won't save the world, but it'll save you cooking tonight. And there's a propane canister in the bed that should fit your stove. The simple kindness hit Hazel harder than Graham's cruelty ever had. She blinked against the heat behind her eyes and managed, "That's thank you. That's very kind." As Oren retrieved the canister, a second vehicle appeared on the driveway. A sleek black county car that looked as natural in the rural setting as a knife on a dinner plate. A middle-aged woman in a crisp pantsuit emerged, clipboard in one hand, picking her way across the muddy drive in heels that were already losing the argument with the terrain. The woman's professional smile did not reach her eyes. "Miss Beckworth, I'm Karen Doyle, Monroe County, Child Protective Services. We received a call expressing concern about the welfare of 2 minors recently relocated to this address." Hazel's stomach dropped through the porch floor. She did not need to ask who had made the call. Graham's strategy was becoming visible. If he could not prevent her from taking this chance, he would make sure she failed. The inspection that followed was thorough, in the way that only bureaucratic assessments can be, methodical, impersonal, documenting every failure without acknowledging any context. Karen Doyle photographed the leaking roof, the dead electrical outlets, the absent water, the broken windows. She asked precise questions about school enrollment, health care, access, financial resources, making notes of Hazel's increasingly tight-voiced answers. The boys watched from the porch. Oren stood nearby, his presence a quiet counterweight to the official invasion, saying nothing but radiating the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent 7 decades deciding that most authorities were wrong about most things. Finally, Karen closed her notebook and delivered her verdict with the practiced neutrality of someone who had memorized the words, "Miss Beckworth, I'll be frank. This property is not currently suitable for children. You have 30 days to address the critical safety issues, functioning water system, approved septic electrical inspection, roof repair, secure windows and doors. If these matters aren't resolved, we'll have no choice but to recommend temporary placement for Emmett and Sawyer." The words landed with the weight of something dropped from a great height. Temporary placement. A bureaucratic phrase for taking her children. Hazel nodded. She did not trust her voice. Karen handed over a detailed violation notice, returned to her vehicle, and departed in a spray of gravel, leaving behind the faint scent of institutional authority and the crushing pressure of a deadline Hazel had no idea how to meet. Oren cleared his throat. 30 days isn't much. Hazel stared at the violation notice. Each line item represented thousands of dollars she did not have. The water system alone, drilling a new well or rehabilitating the collapsed one, would consume her remaining funds several times over. I'll figure something out. The words were hollow. She heard it. Oren heard it. But the old farmer only glanced at the twins, then back at Hazel, and made his own calculation. Maybe I can help with some of it. Got tools, know-how, won't fix everything but might make a dent. Pride and desperation held a brief negotiation in Hazel's chest. Desperation won, the boys and I can work hard. We're quick learners. Something crossed Oren's face that might have been the memory of a smile. You'll need to be. He nodded toward the barn. First thing tomorrow I'll bring my generator. We'll see what we're dealing with. For now, rest. Tina will be by in the morning. She has notions about feeding people. After Oren departed, Hazel connected the propane to the stove-heated water and served Tina's casserole at the battered kitchen table. Paper plates, plastic forks, the camping lantern, casting them all in amber light that softened the reality of what surrounded them. Emmett scraped the last of the casserole from his plate. His appetite restored by warmth and novelty. It's like camping. But inside, and Mr. Oren is going to teach us farm stuff. Sawyer ate more slowly, his fork moving food without urgency, his eyes on his mother. Mom, what if we can't fix everything in 30 days? Will they really take us away? Hazel set down her own fork. She met her son's gaze directly because he had earned directness, because lying to him would cost something she could not afford to lose. That is not going to happen. We have each other, and we have this land. Dorothea Marsh left us clues about making it work, and we're going to figure it out. After the boys fell asleep, Hazel returned to the cellar with her flashlight. She spent hours piecing together Dorothea's research. The property sat atop a complex karst system, limestone formations, riddled with sinkholes and underground channels that explained the farm's inability to retain surface water. But beneath this problematic topography, Dorothea had documented something else entirely, a substantial aquifer trapped below a dense clay layer at approximately 230 feet, far deeper than any farm well of that era could reach. And in the eastern section, the seismic readings that suggested a kimberlite pipe, a geological chimney connecting the Earth's diamond-bearing mantle to the surface. In a folder labeled Trusted Contacts, Hazel found a business card, Hap Jernigan Independent Water and Geological Services. Whether the man still existed after 4 decades was uncertain, but the card was there, and in Hazel's current arithmetic uncertain was infinitely better than impossible. She was replacing Dorothea's files when the crash came from upstairs, a sound like the world breaking in half, followed by Emmett's high-frightened cry. Hazel took the cellar stairs 3 at a time, her flashlight beam lurching wildly across walls and ceiling. In the master bedroom, a section of plaster had given way. Rain poured through the new opening directly onto the bed where her sons had been sleeping. Emmett stood pressed against the far wall, shaking, his breathing already tightening. Sawyer was pulling blankets away from the cascading water, his face white, but his movements deliberate, already solving the problem before the fear could finish arriving. Hazel gathered them both, blankets, pillows, the camping lantern, and moved them to the living room. The old couch protested, but held. She wrapped the boys together, Emmett's inhaler in reach, Sawyer's hand gripping hers, and listened to the rain find every weakness in the house above them. In the darkness, she considered Dorothea Marsh's words. Water finds its way. Tonight, water was finding its way through her roof onto her children's beds, into every crack of a house that was supposed to be their salvation. Tomorrow she would need to find a way to make water work for them instead of against them. Tomorrow she would call a number on a 40-year-old business card and ask a stranger to believe in a dead woman's research. Tomorrow. The clock would start on 30 days. She could not afford to waste. But tonight, with her sons breathing against her in the dark, with the deed still folded against her chest and Dorothea's letter in her pocket, Hazel Beckworth allowed herself one small defiant act. She closed her eyes and imagined water not falling from above, but rising from below, clean, powerful, patient, finding its way through 230 feet of limestone and clay, the way it had for centuries, the way it would long after every person who had ever called this land cursed was forgotten. She did not sleep, but she did stop falling. Dawn arrived without permission, thin gray light pressing through the living room windows, and finding all three of them still tangled together on the old couch. Hazel opened her eyes to the sound of dripping the leak upstairs, still working its way through the house, and the sight of her sons' faces in sleep temporarily unburdened Emmett's lashes, dark against cheeks that were too pale. Sawyer's jaw clenched even in unconsciousness, as if he were solving a problem he hadn't yet named. She extracted herself without waking them, stepped over the blankets, pulled on the floor, and walked to the kitchen. The camping lantern sat where she'd left it on the counter, cold, now the propane stove ticking softly as the house cooled around it. Hazel pulled Dorothea's letter from her pocket and unfolded it beside the business card she'd found in the cellar. Hap Jernigan, the phone number faded but legible. 40 years old, a connection to a woman everyone had called delusional, preserved in a dead researcher's filing system, waiting for someone desperate enough to try it. Hazel dialed before she could talk herself out of it. 2 rings, 3. She was composing what she'd say to a disconnected number recording when a voice answered, gruff, unhurried, the kind of voice that had been roughened by weather rather than anger. Jernigan Water Services. The conversation that followed was brief by necessity. Hazel outlined the property, the failed well, the deep aquifer. Dorothea had documented her financial constraints. She did not mention diamonds. She did not mention Prewitt. She kept her voice level, professional, the way she had once spoken at research conferences before Graham convinced her that confidence was the same thing as selfishness. A long silence on the other end. Then, I remembered Dorothea Marsh. Got laughed out of 3 counties for her theories. Smart woman, though. Too smart for the people around her. Can you come look at the property? I'll be there this afternoon. Can't promise anything, but I'll take a look. Dorothea was one of the few people who believed in my drilling methods when everyone else called them overkill. A pause waited with something Hazel couldn't identify. I owe her that much. The call ended. Hazel sat holding the phone, aware of something shifting inside her chest. Not hope exactly, because hope required energy she didn't have. Something quieter. A door previously locked, turning slightly ajar. Tina Patchett arrived at 9, with homemade biscuits in a cloth-lined basket, a thermos of coffee that smelled like salvation, and hard-boiled eggs still warm from the pot. She took one look at the collapsed ceiling in the master bedroom, the buckets positioned under multiple leaks, Hazel's exhausted face, and did not ask a single question. She simply set down her basket, embraced Hazel with the unself-conscious firmness of a woman who considered physical comfort a practical tool rather than a sentimental gesture, and began organizing. Oren arrived an hour later with his generator tarps and the quiet competence of a man who had been fixing things longer than Hazel had been alive. He assessed the roof damage without commentary, then began teaching the boys how to position tarps, where to anchor the grommets, how to create drainage channels so the water ran off rather than pooling. Sawyer absorbed the instruction with focused intensity. Emmett tried to help, but kept stopping to examine the insects living in the damaged wood, cataloging them under his breath with the obsessive precision that Hazel recognized from her own childhood, when rocks had been more interesting to her than anything the other girls wanted to talk about. By midday, the house was temporarily weather-tight. Oren turned his attention to the well, the pump shed behind the house, the ancient mechanical system inside it. Hazel watched him work, asking questions that revealed her geological knowledge, earning glances of reassessment that she pretended not to notice. He emerged from the shed with grease-blackened hands and a diagnosis delivered in his spare declarative style. Pumps shot, seals gone. But that's not your real problem. Well itself collapsed about 30 feet down. You can see the cave-in with a light. He wiped his hand slowly on a rag, measuring his next words. You'll need a new one. Deep. Deeper than anything around here. I know. Dorothea's research shows an aquifer at 230 feet. Oren's hands went still on the rag. He looked at her differently than he had the day before, not with more warmth, but with something adjacent to it, a recognition that the woman standing in front of him was perhaps not what her circumstances suggested. You've been in the cellar. It was not a question. Hap Jernigan arrived at 3, his truck announcing itself with an engine note that sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than ordinary combustion. The rig mounted in the bed dwarfed the vehicle. Drilling equipment, pipe racks, tool chests, strapped along both sides, the accumulated apparatus of a man who had spent his life punching holes in the earth and listening to what came back. Jernigan himself matched his machinery. Broad-shouldered, slightly stooped, his face tanned into leather by decades of outdoor labor. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned that wasted motion was wasted time, and wasted time was the only resource you never recovered. He acknowledged Hazel with a nod that contained both greeting and evaluation, then followed her to the cellar without small talk. For 20 minutes he hunched over Dorothea's drafting table, examining her surveys and maps with the focused silence of a man reading a language he already spoke. His questions, when they came, were precise. The karst topography, the clay barrier at depth, the anomalous readings in the eastern section. Hazel answered from Dorothea's notes and from her own training, and something in the exchange, the rhythm of technical minds working a shared problem, unlocked a part of her that had been sealed for years. The last time she had spoken this language with another human being, she had been standing in a university lab at 11 o'clock at night. Graham had called. His voice had carried that particular tone of patience, as weapon he'd perfected. The boys need a mother, not a scientist. Come home. She had gone home. She had not gone back. Jernigan straightened from the table, wincing in a way that suggested his back had its own opinions about decades of physical labor. Not saying she was wrong, Dorothea had good instincts, but reaching that deep with the equipment available, then impossible. That's why nobody believed her. Outside, he surveyed the property with professional calculation, the collapsed well, the eastern field, the barn, the house where two boys watched from the porch with the wary curiosity of animals who had been moved too many times. He crouched, scooped a handful of soil, rubbed it between his fingers. The estimate he provided, $82,000 for a proper deep well, might as well have been denominated in years of Hazel's life. She felt the number land in her body, a physical sensation, the way bad news always arrived in the stomach first and worked outward. Jernigan watched the defeat cross her face, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, still gruff, still professional, but with something underneath that Hazel would later identify as the particular stubbornness of a man who had been dismissed by the same world that had dismissed Dorothea Marsh. There's an alternative, less ideal, but possible. The proposal was straightforward. He would drill on contingency payment only if they reached water. If successful, a reduced cost of $30,000 structured over 3 years. If not, Jernigan absorbed the loss. Hazel studied him for the trap, the hidden clause, the angle. She had spent 9 years with a man who never offered anything without calculating his return. Why would you take that risk? Jernigan's gaze drifted toward the eastern field, lingering on the spot where Dorothea had circled and circled and circled. Her Kimberlite notation, Dorothea Marsh was right about a lot of things people laughed at. Maybe I'm curious what else she was right about. His face hardened into something more familiar, practical, unsentimental. Besides, William Prewitt had his eye on this property for decades. Whatever he wants, I'm inclined to help prevent him getting it. They shook hands. His grip was calloused, hers was not. Both held firm. The drilling began the next morning with a sound that Hazel felt in her teeth The thunderous percussion of metal driving into stone, the rig shuddering with each revolution as it bit through the first layer of topsoil and encountered the limestone beneath. Birds scattered from the oak trees. Emmett covered his ears but refused to go inside, watching the machinery with the same fixed attention he gave to his insect observations. Sawyer stood beside Jernigan, asking questions about pressure gauges and drill speeds with an earnestness that drew the older man into patient explanation. By mid-morning, a small audience had gathered at a respectful distance. Orrin and Tina, an elderly couple from the next property over, the pastor from the Methodist church in town who had driven out after hearing about the drilling from someone who had heard it from someone else. Rural information networks operated faster than any technology Hazel had encountered. Tina distributed coffee from a thermos the size of a small child. Conversations hummed at the edges of the worksite. Curiosity, skepticism, the particular energy of people who had come to witness what most of them expected would be failure. Hazel caught fragments as she moved between the drill site and the house. Waste of time. Same as it was in 82. Marsh curse all over again. At 50 feet limestone, at 100 more limestone interspersed with chert and shale. At 150, the drill's behavior changed progress, slowing to inches per hour as it encountered the dense clay layer Dorothea had documented, blue-gray, nearly impermeable, the cap on the bottle as Jernigan described it during a break to change bits. What's trapped your water underneath? We need to punch through. The new bit diamond tipped gleaming with the cruel precision of something designed to cut through geological time cost more than Hazel's car. Jernigan handled it the way Orrin handled his best tools, with a reverence that went beyond monetary value. Afternoon shadows lengthened, the spectators thinned. Emmett's breathing tightened with the dust, and Hazel sent both boys to the porch, anxiety knotting in her stomach as progress stalled. At 200 feet still clay, Jernigan's face, which had maintained professional neutrality throughout the day, showed the first hairline cracks of concern. He said nothing. He did not need to. The watching neighbors read it anyway, and their murmured commentary shifted from skepticism to something worse, pity. Then at 228 feet, the drill dropped. Several inches of sudden frictionless descent, as if the earth had simply opened its hand. Jernigan killed the power instantly, his movements sharp with a focus Hazel recognized from her own lab work, the controlled urgency of a scientist who knows they have encountered something significant and cannot afford to damage it. He switched to manual control, lowered the drill another foot, and extracted it with agonizing care. The material clinging to the bit told the story before Jernigan spoke. Different color, different texture, saturated limestone where only dry clay should have been. His poker face broke. Not into a smile. Jernigan did not seem built for smiling, but into something that might have been its structural equivalent, a settling of tension around the eyes, a slight straightening of the stooped shoulders. got your clay barrier, and underneath, he indicated the wet stone on the bit. Limestone again, but soaked through. Good sign. The remaining spectators pressed closer. Even the elderly couple who had been preparing to leave turned back, caught by the shift in Jernigan's body language. He reattached the drill, proceeded with heightened caution. At 230 feet, resistance dropped to nearly nothing. The test pump coughed to life. For several long seconds, nothing emerged but mechanical noise and the smell of engine exhaust. Hazel stood with her hands pressed together, not praying exactly, but holding herself in the posture of someone waiting for a verdict that will determine everything that follows. The gurgling started deep, as if the earth were clearing its throat. Then a rush, then an eruption that sent everyone stumbling backward, water clean and furious, shooting 20 feet into the air from the test pipe before Jernigan could wrestle the flow under control. A crystalline arc backlit by afternoon sun, scattering light into prismatic fragments that hung in the air like something the land had been saving for exactly this moment. Applause, spontaneous, startled from people who had come to watch failure and found themselves witnesses to something else entirely. Tina Patchett was crying openly, her hands clasped at her chest. Oren stood motionless, his weathered face unreadable, except for a single nod, the same nod he had given Hazel the first day, the one that meant a decision had been confirmed. And the boys. Sawyer stood perfectly still, watching the water arc and fall with an expression Hazel had never seen on his face. Not doubt, not calculation, but pure, uncomplicated wonder. The look of a child who has been allowed briefly to believe that the world might work in his mother's favor. Emmett had no such restraint. He broke from the porch at a dead run, splashing through the muddy puddle, forming around the drill site, his arms outstretched, his laughter cutting through the mechanical noise, and the applause and the sound of water finally doing what Dorothea Marsh had promised it would do. Hazel could not move. She stood rooted to the spot where she had been standing when the water came, her chest so full of something, relief, vindication, grief for the years she had spent not trusting herself. That movement seemed physically impossible. Water streamed down the test pipe, pooled in the red clay, soaked into earth that had been waiting for it, and she thought of Dorothea's letter, the words she had memorized without trying. Water finds its way. It had, through 230 feet of limestone and clay, past 40 years of ridicule and neglect, around every obstacle the geology could produce. It had found its way. Jernigan let the water flow for several minutes, collecting samples in glass jars. As the initial eruption settled into a steady, manageable stream, something caught Hazel's eye, glints of light in the sediment washing up around the drill pipe. Reflections that didn't behave the way ordinary wet stone reflected light. Sharper, more angular. Emmett saw them too. His curiosity, the same impulse that catalogued insects and noticed rock formations and drove him to examine every unfamiliar thing, the world put in front of him pulled him toward the muddy slurry before Hazel could intervene. He plunged both hands into the silty water and came up grinning, mud dripping from his fingers, palm extended. "Look, Mom, sparkly rocks." Jernigan froze. The shift in his body was subtle, a tightening across the shoulders, a stillness in his hands that had been in constant motion all day. He crossed to Emmett, crouched slowly, and examined what the boy held. Wiped one stone clean against his shirt, held it to the light, then another. His voice, when it came, was pitched low enough that only Hazel and Emmett could hear beneath the continued sounds of celebration. "Son, those aren't just rocks." Hazel took the stone from Jernigan's outstretched hand. She knew before her fingers closed around it. The crystalline structure was wrong for quartz, too hard, too angular, refracting light in a pattern her training recognized, even if her conscious mind hadn't caught up. She held it between thumb and forefinger, turning it in the afternoon sun, and felt the hairs rise on her forearms. Jernigan confirmed what her body already knew. Industrial grade, that one, small but real. He indicated another stone in Emmett's palm, larger with a clarity that caught the light and held it. And that one that might be gem quality. The world rearranged itself in Hazel's hand. Dorothea Marsh had not been delusional. The kimberlite pipe was real. The diamonds were real. The woman scientist, who had been ridiculed and silenced and driven from her own property, had been right about everything, and the evidence was sitting in a 10-year-old boy's muddy palm. Jernigan helped Emmett collect the remaining stones with quiet efficiency. Sealing them in a sample jar, he handed to Hazel with a look that communicated everything words would have complicated. "This changes things. Be careful who you tell." The neighbors, still absorbed in the miracle of water, noticed nothing. That evening, after the crowds dispersed, and Jernigan departed with promises to return for the permanent installation, Orrin lingered on the porch. The old farmer said nothing for a long time, watching the last light drain from the sky. Then, without turning to face Hazel, "I saw what Emmett found. Those weren't ordinary stones." Hazel weighed her options. Orrin had earned trust through action, not promises, the rarest currency she knew. He saved her the decision by continuing. Dorothea was right all along. That's why she disappeared. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right in a way that threatened certain interests. His gaze moved toward town, toward the direction where Prewitt Mining maintained its offices. The father was a hard man. The son learned at his knee. The following days blurred into a rhythm Hazel had not experienced since graduate school, physical labor punctuated by intellectual urgency, exhaustion, offset by the momentum of discovery. Jernigan returned to install the permanent pump system. Water flowed through pipes that had been dry for decades, emerging from faucets in brown bursts that gradually cleared to crystal. The first hot shower, all three of them taking turns under water, that was slightly rusty and entirely miraculous, transformed their spirits more than any event since their arrival. Emmett and Sawyer shampooed each other's hair with the extravagant lathering of children who had been rationing, and Hazel stood beneath the stream, with her eyes closed, feeling grime and fear dissolve in equal measure. Oren coordinated repairs with the understated authority of a man accustomed to organizing without announcing. One morning, his grandsons appeared, two teenagers who nodded politely at Hazel and immediately began replacing rotted porch boards. That afternoon, a licensed electrician from town arrived explaining that Harold from the Methodist Church had mentioned the situation. He spent 4 hours rewiring the most critical circuits and left without presenting a bill, saying only that the church deacons fund covered community needs and disqualified. More visitors followed. A woman Hazel didn't recognize left a box of canning jars and preserved vegetables on the porch with no note. The school bus driver, learning the boys' stop was half a mile from the main road, began making the full turn down the driveway without being asked. A retired carpenter named Virgil drove out one Saturday with a truckload of lumber and spent the morning teaching Sawyer how to measure, cut, and join wood for new window frames, the boy's small hands growing more confident with each piece. Hazel observed this accumulating generosity with a disorientation she could not fully name. In Graham's world, favors were investments, kindness was leverage. Every gesture carried a balance sheet. Here people brought food and labor and expertise to a stranger's doorstep and seemed baffled when she asked what she owed them. Tina's explanation, delivered while organizing yet another donated meal, was simple to the point of bewildering. Neighbors help, that's what the word means. Between repairs, Hazel pursued the diamond discovery with scientific discipline. In Dorothea's cellar, she photographed each stone against a ruled background and recorded their physical characteristics. Without specialized equipment, she could only perform the rudimentary tests described in Dorothea's own notes: hardness, thermal conductivity, specific gravity. Each test supported the preliminary identification. These were diamonds. The question was authentication. Professional assessment would require outside expertise, and outside expertise meant exposure to Prewitt, to the county, to a system that had already demonstrated it could be leveraged against her. Jernigan provided the answer, a retired gemologist named Dr. Nolan Firth, living 40 miles east in Briarwood. Former Tiffany's evaluator, kept a private laboratory, and the detail Jernigan offered with grim satisfaction. He had a long-standing personal grievance against the Prewitt family over a land dispute that had cost him his country property. Hazel drove to Briarwood on a Tuesday morning while Oren and Tina watched the boys. Firth's home was a modest craftsman bungalow, its garden tended with the same precision evident in his laboratory: microscopes, spectrometers, gemological instruments arranged with the ordered beauty of tools that had been used with respect for decades. The man himself was spare, meticulous, his intelligent eyes assessing Hazel and her sample jar with immediate professional focus. 2 hours of examination, magnification, light refraction tests, thermal conductivity analysis. Then Firth removed his loupe, set it on the bench with the care of a man who understood the value of what he held and regarded Hazel with new respect. Genuine diamonds, no question, mostly industrial-grade drill bits, technical applications, but these three, he indicated the largest specimens, gem quality, excellent clarity, small but valuable. The valuation exceeded what Hazel had allowed herself to imagine. The industrial stones collectively worth several thousand. The gem-quality specimens, particularly the one Emmett had pulled from the mud with such innocent triumph, potentially 15 to 20,000 after cutting and certification. But these are just surface indicators, Firth cautioned. The real value is what might be below. A productive kimberlite pipe could contain millions. That's what Prewitt is after, not your 43 acres of cursed farmland. Armed with Firth's written assessment, Hazel returned to the farm and contacted Sarah Blackburn, an attorney Jernigan knew who specialized in mineral rights. Formidable, silver-haired, with the confidence of a woman who had spent her career outmaneuvering men who underestimated her. Blackburn reviewed everything: Dorothea's research, Firth's evaluation, the stones themselves, and outlined a two-pronged strategy: file mineral rights documentation with state authorities immediately, establishing clear ownership, sell enough diamonds through legitimate channels to address immediate financial needs. The transaction arranged through Blackburn's contacts happened with startling efficiency. A broker from Chicago, professional and brisk, confirmed Firth's assessment with portable equipment. Wholesale pricing, lower than retail, but immediate. By the following afternoon, Hazel held a cashier's check large enough to cover critical repairs, Emmett's medication, and Blackburn's retainer, not wealth, not security, but oxygen when she had been drowning. Emmett's prescription was filled that same day. Watching him breathe freely for the first time in weeks. No whistle, no rattle, just the quiet rhythm of lungs, doing their work without obstruction. Hazel felt something recalibrate in her chest, a settling of weight she had carried so long it had become invisible. The farm continued its slow transformation. The community workday happened on a Saturday that dawned bright and cold, the kind of autumn perfection that made the rolling foothills look like a painting someone had forgotten to sign. Cars and trucks lined the driveway by 9 o'clock. Women organized a food station on the repaired porch. Men and teenagers dispersed into team, addressing different repair needs. Sawyer worked alongside the retired carpenter all morning, measuring and cutting with increasing confidence, his face set in concentration. That had nothing to do with worry, and everything to do with purpose. Emmett became the official runner, carrying tools, delivering messages, providing water from their well, with the proprietary pride of someone who understood that the water in his hands had come from beneath his own ground. By evening the house had crossed a threshold Hazel had not believed possible in so short a time. The remaining roof leaks were properly patched. Every window was intact. The electrical system carried a licensed inspection certificate. Smoke detectors, beeped their confirmations in every room. The porch stood solid and freshly painted. It was not beautiful. It was not finished. But it was safe, and safety, Hazel had learned, was not a baseline condition of life. It was an achievement. Then the counterattack came, and it came from 3 directions at once. The first blow arrived by courier on Monday morning, a court filing from Graham's attorney requesting emergency temporary custody based on unsafe living conditions, the hearing scheduled for the following Tuesday, 8 days away. The documentation cited the original CPS report, the deputy's inspection photographs, and a sworn statement from Graham characterizing Hazel as increasingly fixated on fantastical mineral discoveries rather than addressing her children's basic needs. The second blow came by sheriff's deputy that same afternoon, a temporary restraining order prohibiting any mining excavation or mineral extraction on the property, filed by Prewitt Mining and Development, citing environmental concerns, issued by Judge Watson, the same judge assigned to the custody hearing. The coordination was so transparent, it would have been admirable if it weren't aimed at dismantling her life. The third blow arrived in the county mail notification that the property's tax assessment had been revised upward by 3,000% based on mineral potential. The accompanying bill exceeded her remaining resources by a factor she could not calculate without feeling physically ill. Blackburn's voice on the phone carried the controlled fury of an attorney who recognized a familiar pattern. This is textbook Prewitt. They're using environmental regulations, tax authority, and your custody case as a coordinated pressure campaign. Freeze the diamond documentation, inflate financial obligations, force a sale before you understand what you're sitting on. Hazel listened, phone pressed to her ear, watching through the kitchen window as Sawyer practiced his carpentry on a section of fence while Emmett collected soil samples in glass jars he'd found in the cellar, labeling them with the same meticulous handwriting Dorothea Marsh had used. Her sons building something on land that 3 separate instruments of power were trying to strip from their hands. Graham appeared that evening, unannounced, his sedan pulling into the driveway with the polished certainty of a vehicle that had never known a pothole it couldn't simply afford to ignore. He emerged carrying an envelope and wearing the expression Hazel knew best, concern and satisfaction in equal measure, the face of a man who has been proven right about something and wants to make sure you know it. The conversation unfolded on the porch, with Oren within earshot in the yard, pretending to repair a gate hinge while missing nothing. Graham presented Prewitt's latest offer, $75,000, clean transaction, relocation assistance. The tax issue resolved as part of the deal. His voice carried the tone she remembered from their marriage, the one that presented capitulation as wisdom and resistance as pathology. Sometimes reality has to hit hard before wisdom prevails. Take the money, Hazel. Get an apartment in town. We can discuss a more reasonable custody arrangement. What is asking? I'll see you in court on Tuesday, Graham." Hazel's voice surprised her with its steadiness. "And I suggest you disclose to Judge Watson that you're representing Prewitt's financial interests while pursuing custody of our children. Judges tend to notice undisclosed conflicts." The crack in Graham's composure was small but unmistakable, a flinch behind the eyes, the micro-expression of a man who has been touched in a place he believed was protected. Whatever arrangement existed between him and Prewitt had not been structured to withstand legal scrutiny. Hazel filed a reaction away a weapon she might need. The boys returned from school that afternoon and immediately sensed the atmospheric pressure between their parents. Emmett gravitated to Hazel's side, his hand finding hers. Sawyer approached more slowly, his gaze moving between mother and father with the navigational instinct of a child who has learned to map the emotional terrain between the adults responsible for his safety. Graham crouched to their level, arms open. "Hey, champs, maybe we'll grab ice cream this weekend." Sawyer's response landed with a clarity that silenced the porch. "We're helping fix our home, Dad. Mr. Oren showed me how to frame a window. I can't go for ice cream. I promise to help with the shutters tomorrow." Emmett nodded, his voice small but certain. "I'm the tool runner. It's important." Hazel watched Graham's face, process the information his sons choosing labor on a broken farm over leisure with their father, and saw something she had never seen in 9 years of marriage. Not anger, not contempt, but bewilderment. The genuine confusion of a man confronting evidence that his model of the world might contain a structural flaw. He left without pressing the point. The envelope containing Prewitt's offer remained on the porch railing, where he'd placed it, unopened, collecting the first drops of evening dew. After the boys were asleep, Hazel sat alone on the porch steps. The night was clear, and cold stars scattered across the sky with the extravagant carelessness of a universe that did not concern itself with custody hearings or tax assessments. Prewitt's envelope sat beside her. $75,000, enough for a small apartment. School supplies, Emmett's medication for a year, a car that started on the first try. Safety, the conventional kind, the kind that came with addresses and landlords and monthly payments, instead of leaking roofs and hidden cellars and diamonds pulled from mud by a child's hands. She picked up the envelope, turned it over, felt the weight of the single document inside, an offer to purchase a clean exit from a fight she was losing on every measurable front. The deed was still in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out and held both documents, one in each hand. The deed to 43 acres of cursed land on the left, the offer to make it all go away on the right. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then building the way North Carolina rain did in October, patient, and then sudden, as if the sky had been deliberating and finally reached a verdict. Hazel looked down at her hands. The left one, holding the deed, was rougher than it had been 3 weeks ago, calluses forming at the base of each finger, a scratch across one knuckle from helping Oren replace a section of roof flashing, dirt under the nails that no amount of scrubbing fully removed, embedded in the whorls of her fingerprints like a second identity. These were not the hands of the woman who had stood on the courthouse steps, clutching this same piece of paper. That woman had been falling. This woman, scratched, exhausted, outmatched, was standing on ground she had earned with those hands. She set Prewitt's envelope on the step beside her unopened. The rain intensified, soaking through her jacket, plastering her hair against her forehead in a way that echoed the very first moment of this story, the courthouse steps, the slashing October rain, the deed that meant nothing to anyone but her. But the echo was imperfect, because the woman sitting in this rain was not the woman who had stood in that one. Something had changed at a depth no one could see. Something had found its way through. Hazel pressed the deed against her chest, folded her arms over it, and let the rain come. Tuesday was 6 days away. She did not know if she would win. She did not know if the diamonds would matter, or the community's testimony, or the attorney's strategies, or the video testimony of a dead scientist that a woman in Vermont might or might not possess. She knew only that she would walk into that courtroom with mud under her nails and water in her well, and 2 boys who had learned on this broken piece of land that their mother was someone worth believing in. The rain fell harder. Hazel did not go inside. The rain stopped before dawn, as if it too had said everything it needed to say. Hazel rose from the porch steps with stiff joints and a damp jacket and a clarity she had not possessed the night before. Prewitt's envelope still sat where she had left it, its paper warped and swollen with moisture, the ink of the return address beginning to bleed. She carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, not a rejection, not yet, but a deferral. A decision held in suspension while she pursued the one strategy that might make the decision unnecessary. She needed to find Dorothea Marsh. Not the dead woman, Hazel understood that much, but someone connected to her, someone who had inherited her research, her evidence, her documented account of what had happened on this property and why she had been forced to leave. The name from the letter surfaced: Lucille. If my niece Lucille ever comes looking, tell her I kept my promise. A niece meant family. Family meant records, connections, a trail that might still be followed 40 years after it went cold. Hazel began with the tools available to her, Dorothea's own files. In the cellar, she searched systematically through folders she had previously examined only for geological data, now looking for personal correspondence, legal documents, anything bearing a surname. She found it in a manila envelope marked personal, tucked behind the seismic surveys, a faded photograph of 2 women standing in front of the farmhouse, both squinting against the sun. On the back, in Dorothea's careful hand, with Lucille Summer, 76. And below that, a partial address, a street name in Burlington, Vermont, no house number, the ink too degraded to read completely. It was almost nothing. It was more than she'd had an hour ago. The breakthrough, when it came, arrived not through technology or legal databases, but through the oldest information network in rural America, the church. Tina Patchett, who had embraced the search for Lucille, with the focused determination of a woman who believed that lost things were meant to be found, contacted her denomination's national directory. A retired minister in Burlington remembered a Dorothea not by that name but by description. A former scientist who had attended his congregation briefly in the early 80s. Quiet woman, he recalled, carried something heavy she never talked about. She'd moved south to care for a sister, and he had lost track. The sister led to a retirement community near Brattleboro, Vermont. The retirement community led to an administrator who confirmed that Dorothea Marsh had resided there from 1992 until her death in 2017. And the administrator, once she understood the nature of Hazel's connection to the property, offered the thread that pulled everything together. Her niece still visits, maintains the memorial garden we planted. Lucille Taverner. She owns a bookshop about 20 miles from here. Hazel called that evening, standing in the kitchen with the cellar door open at her feet and Dorothea's photograph in her hand. The phone rang 4 times, 5. Then a woman's voice, cautious in the way people are cautious when unknown numbers appear on their screens, Taverner Books. The conversation began carefully, 2 strangers circling a shared absence, testing the weight of each piece of information before offering the next. But when Hazel described the hidden cellar, the surveys the letter addressed to the new family, something in Lucille Taverner's voice shifted from wariness to recognition, and from recognition to something that sounded like the particular ache of vindication. Deferred too long. And Dorothea would have loved knowing someone finally took her work seriously. She never stopped believing, even after they destroyed her professionally, even after she stopped publishing, stopped talking about it, stopped doing everything except keeping her notes in order, just in case. Lucille confirmed what Hazel had pieced together from fragments: the diamond discovery, the coordinated campaign to discredit Dorothea's findings, the escalating pressure from Prewitt's father that had eventually driven her from the property. But she added a detail that changed the strategic landscape entirely, and Dora made a video before she died, sat in front of a camera for 3 hours and recorded everything: the research, the intimidation, the specific individuals involved. She called it her insurance policy, said the truth would surface eventually, and when it did, she wanted her testimony on record. A sworn video deposition from the original researcher, documentation of historical findings that predated the current restraining order, evidence of a decades-long pattern of suppression by the same company now attempting to acquire the property through coordinated legal pressure. Hazel's next words came out before strategy could temper them. Would you be willing to bring those materials here? Lucille's response landed with the simple force of someone who had been waiting a very long time to say it. I'll do better than bring them. I'll testify myself. Tell me when and where. Blackburn received the news with the restrained intensity of an attorney who has just been handed ammunition she did not expect. Pre-existing documentation from the original researcher constitutes historical evidence, not new exploration. Prewitt's restraining order covers current activities on the property. It can suppress testimony about findings made 40 years ago by a different scientist. This is a parallel track they didn't anticipate. The days before Tuesday compressed into a density that made normal time feel wasteful. Blackburn filed mineral rights documentation with state authorities. Lucille Taverner drove south from Vermont with a station wagon loaded with archive boxes and the quiet ferocity of a woman fulfilling a promise made to someone she had loved. Hazel organized documentation of every repair, every improvement, every piece of evidence that the farm was no longer the ruin depicted in Graham's custody filing. Character witnesses were confirmed: Orentina, the school's principal, the Methodist pastor, the electrician who had donated his time. And through it all the farm kept working. Water flowed, the roof held, Emmett breathed without wheezing. Sawyer measured and cut and joined his carpentry, growing more assured with each day, his silences becoming less about worry and more about concentration. The land which everyone had called cursed continued to behave as though it had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to listen to it. Tuesday morning broke clear and sharp, October's last gesture, before November arrived with its heavier demands. Hazel dressed the boys in their best clothes ironed the night before on the kitchen table, using an ancient iron Tina had produced from her attic. Sawyer submitted to the process with stoic tolerance. Emmett fidgeted until Hazel straightened his collar and said very quietly that she needed him to be brave today, and he went still, understanding in the way children understand things, not through the words but through the frequency beneath them. Oren and Tina drove them to the courthouse, both wearing clothes Hazel had not seen before. Oren in a suit that fit the way suits fit men, who own exactly one Tina in a dress with small flowers that she touched nervously at the hem. Their presence said what their clothes could not. We are here to be counted. The courthouse hallway held the opposing forces in uncomfortable proximity. Graham and his attorney occupied one bench, their postures radiating the practiced confidence of men who believed procedure was on their side. Desmond Prewitt sat nearby, his presence technically unnecessary for a custody hearing, his attendance a message delivered without words. And Karen Doyle from CPS seated beside Prewitt, reviewing documents, the social worker and the mining executive sharing space in a way that confirmed alignments Hazel had suspected but not proven. Blackburn arrived carrying a briefcase that appeared to contain its own gravitational field. Her silver-streaked hair pulled into a bun that managed to convey both practicality and authority. She reviewed final details with Hazel in the corridor, her voice low and precise. Watson is a careful judge. He follows evidence. Give him evidence, and he'll follow it to the right place. The hearing proceeded with the grinding formality of a system designed to be thorough at the expense of being humane. Graham's attorney constructed his case methodically, the initial property conditions, the CPS documentation, photographs of leaking ceilings and broken windows. He characterized Hazel as impulsive, financially unstable, increasingly preoccupied with unsubstantiated mineral claims at the expense of her children's welfare. He referenced Dorothea Marsh's history as cautionary parallel, another woman consumed by geological fantasies on the same property, ultimately proven unstable. Hazel listened without reacting, though the effort of stillness cost her something. She could feel being spent like a battery discharging in real time. Beside her, Blackburn made occasional notes, her pen moving with the unhurried confidence of someone keeping score. When Blackburn rose to present the defense, she did not argue. She showed photographs of the farm as it stood, now repaired, roof intact, windows, functioning water system, documented by licensed inspection, school enrollment records, medical receipts showing Emmett's prescriptions filled and current, a stack of professional certifications confirming every safety improvement the county had required. Then the witnesses. Oren, who described the property's transformation with the spare precision of a man who measured things for a living and found them sufficient. Tina, who spoke about the boys' integration into the community with the warmth of someone who had watched it happen from her own kitchen table. The school principal, who noted Emmett's enthusiasm and Sawyer's quiet leadership among his new classmates. The pastor, who described the community workday in terms that made it sound less like charity and more like what it actually was, people recognizing their own reflection in someone else's struggle. Judge Watson asked the boys to speak with him privately. Standard procedure, Blackburn had explained. A conversation, not an interrogation. Hazel watched them disappear through the chamber door. Sawyer, walking with his shoulders set, Emmett reaching for his brother's hand at the last moment, and felt time distort around her, each minute stretching to accommodate the full weight of what was being decided behind that closed door. They returned after 15 minutes that lasted the length of Hazel's entire adult life. Emmett hugged her immediately, his whisper carrying across the silent courtroom with the penetrating clarity of a child who does not yet understand volume control. I told him about the diamonds, Mom. Hazel almost laughed. Almost. During a brief recess before the ruling, Graham appeared at her side in the corridor. Not beside her, exactly adjacent, maintaining the careful distance of a man approaching a conversation he had not planned to have. His tie was loosened. His attorney was elsewhere on the phone, not watching. When Graham spoke, his voice lacked the polish that usually coated it, and what remained underneath was something Hazel had not heard in years' uncertainty. He wasn't entirely honest with me, Prewitt. Graham's gaze fixed on the courthouse floor tiles as if they contained information relevant to his predicament. I was told this was about access roads, quarry logistics. When I asked for documentation on the tax reassessment procedures valuation methodology, I was told to stop asking. He paused. I don't stop asking, Hazel. You know that about me. Whatever else went wrong between us, you know I don't cut corners professionally." Hazel said nothing. She let the silence do what silence does when someone is in the process of hearing themselves speak the truth for the first time. Graham continued, still addressing the floor. "The boys seem settled, more than I expected. Sawyer talked to the judge about window framing, measured dimensions, cited the specific lumber he'd used." A pause. "I've never heard him talk like that, about anything." He straightened, met her eyes briefly, long enough for Hazel to see something she recognized, but could not name, something between regret and the reluctant awareness that the world was larger than his model of it had allowed. Then he walked away back toward his attorney and did not look at her again before the hearing resumed. Judge Watson delivered his ruling without preamble or sentiment. Primary physical custody with the mother conditional on continued compliance with county housing standards. Expanded visitation for the father. Co-parenting counseling for both. Review in 90 days. The words entered Hazel's body, not as sound but as sensation, a releasing of pressure she had been holding so long she had forgotten it was there. Her hands unclenched, her shoulders dropped, her lungs expanded fully for what felt like the first time since she had stood on the courthouse steps in the rain, holding a deed to land no one wanted with $400 to her name. Sawyer reached her first, his arms wrapping around her waist with a fierceness that contradicted every careful, measured thing about him. Emmett followed, pressing his face against her hip, his breathing steady and clear, and Hazel held them both on the courthouse steps, the same limestone steps where the story had begun, and looked up at a sky that was for the first time in weeks entirely free of rain. Sunlight fell across the plaza in long October angles, warming the stone beneath her feet, and she thought of water. Not the rain that had soaked through her jacket that first day, not the leaks that had driven them from room to room in the dark, not even the eruption from the well that had changed everything. She thought of water the way Dorothea Marsh must have thought of it, patient, persistent, indifferent to obstacles, finding its way through 230 feet of stone, because that is what water does. It does not argue with the rock. It does not resent the clay. It simply continues molecule by molecule, century by century, until the path exists because the water made it. Orrin and Tina waited by the truck, giving the family their moment. When Hazel finally approached, Orrin extended his hand, not for a handshake, but palm up, offering something. A small envelope unsealed. Inside a photograph Hazel had not seen before, Dorothea Marsh standing in front of the farmhouse, younger than Hazel had imagined, her expression caught between defiance and joy, one hand resting on the porch railing that Sawyer had helped rebuild. On the back, in handwriting, Hazel now knew as well as her own, this land has never been cursed. It has only been misunderstood. Orrin's voice was quiet. "Found it in my barn last week. Must have been there since Dorothea's time, been waiting for the right person to give it to." Spring arrived the way it arrives in the Carolina foothills, not all at once, but in increments each day, adding a degree of warmth. a shade of green, a new voice to the chorus of birds that had discovered the properties mature oaks were worth singing from. The fields that had been chest-high with weeds when Hazel first turned onto the rutted driveway were cleared now, the soil turned and resting, waiting for decisions about what to plant. The fence lines stood straight. The barn doors hung true on new tracks, their fresh red paint so vivid against the green hillside that it looked like something a child would draw. The idea of a barn simple and bright and exactly right. Inside the farmhouse, morning light moved through clean windows and fell across floors that no longer creaked with rot, but with the settled voice of old wood that has been cared for. The kitchen still wearing its 1970s bones, the avocado stove replaced but the oak table restored, and gleaming smelled of coffee and the biscuits Hazel had learned to make from Tina's recipe, imperfect, but improving the way most things worth doing were. Emmett sat at that table bent over a notebook where he was cataloguing rock samples from the eastern field with labels that mirrored Dorothea's handwriting style, a tribute he had adopted without being asked, the unconscious inheritance of one curious mind from another. His breathing was quiet, his inhaler sat in the kitchen drawer present but unneeded for weeks. The dampness and mold that had triggered his symptoms replaced by dry rooms and clean air. Sawyer was already outside, visible through the kitchen window, measuring lumber for a raised garden bed he had designed himself. His movements carried the unhurried confidence of someone who understood that precision was not slowness, but its opposite, the fastest route between intention and result. Orrin stood nearby, not instructing, but watching the way a man watches a process that no longer requires his intervention. On the kitchen table beside Emmett's notebook, two objects sat in the morning light. The deed to 43 acres, its folds softened by months of handling the county seal, still visible beneath coffee stains and the fine dust that no amount of cleaning ever fully removed from a farmhouse, and beside it, in a small glass jar, a single diamond, the first one Emmett had pulled from the mud, uncut, unpolished, no larger than a pea. Catching the light from the kitchen window and holding it the way only a diamond can, breaking it into components and scattering them across the table like a small private celebration. Both objects had been called worthless by someone who did not look closely enough. Both had turned out to be something else entirely. Hazel poured her coffee and stood at the window, watching Sawyer work and Orrin watch, and the spring light pour across land that had waited 30 years for someone to understand what it was offering. She did not think about Graham's next visit, or the ongoing mineral rights proceedings, or the environmental assessment that would eventually confirm what Dorothea had known and Prewitt had tried to bury. Those things would unfold in their own time, through their own channels, with their own weight and consequence. She thought instead about water, about how it existed beneath this farm 4 millennia before anyone drilled for it, about how it did not require belief to be real, or approval to be valuable, or recognition to continue its patient work through stone, about how the only difference between a dry well and a flowing one was depth, not the water's absence, but the failure to reach far enough down. She thought about Dorothea Marsh, who had reached far enough down and been punished for it, and about herself standing in Dorothea's kitchen, drinking coffee made with Dorothea's water, raising her children on Dorothea's land, carrying forward a truth that had been buried but never destroyed. The deed and the diamond sat together in the morning light. Outside, Sawyer's hammer struck true. Emmet turned a page. Somewhere beneath their feet, at 230 feet of depth, water moved through ancient limestone in the darkness, following paths it had carved over centuries, indifferent to the seasons changing above, indifferent to the names people called the land it nourished, flowing with the quiet certainty of something that has always known where it is going. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever held something everyone called worthless and known somewhere deep that they were wrong? If this story reminded you of your own, leave a comment and tell us about it. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss a story. Thank you for listening, and good night.